Welcome to Craft Politics, everyone. My name is Joseph Lavoie.
I'm Andrew Percy.
And this week, I am unfortunately, and as if you're watching this on YouTube, you can see I'm stuck in a hotel room in Ottawa. I had to fly from
Oh,
Vancouver to Ottawa today.
you have my
Um,
sympathy. Although at least you're using your elite status again and all the rest of it, and you were in the lounges on Air Canada,
no,
and you had a
there
foot
were,
massage and all the rest
no,
of it. The
there was
bath
no
of
lounge.
milk that you were able to lay in before you were.
This is gonna sound so snooty of me, but I mean the being in a lounge these days is not a particularly pleasant experience.
So they let ordinary people in, Jose. Is
It just
that why? Is
it's
it?
like people have discovered scrambled eggs and breakfast sausages for the first time in their lives, and it's just like quest for fire. I just find it's a disgusting thing to experience.
Whereas
I
what you
mostly avoid it.
wanted were obviously egg whites because they're healthy for you, and artisan sausages, right, from you know,
Yeah,
a wild boar that raised itself and then
with
sacrificed
classical
itself.
music playing in the
Yes, of
background.
course.
Yeah.
Oh my
So
word.
no, oh no. Hey,
Anyway,
so I'm back in the hotel to do this show, and I realized, oh, I need to get a beer for the show. So, because it's Ottawa and everything shuts down early, and also you just can't just go. There's nothing downtown. I was facing this predicament, so I was out having catching up with two colleagues, and ABK saved me the day. He pulled the bartender aside at this establishment, which we won't name because I don't want them to get in trouble. Because we have extremely communist laws in Canada on liquor consumption. It was like, my friend here needs a can to go. Is it possible for us to buy one from behind the bar? And day was saved.
oh, very
Bartender
good.
stepped up. I was able to walk to the hotel with a can purchased from behind the bar, and so as a result, I'm
So
drinking
you've technically broken the law to get this beer, which
probably
Brits won't understand because you can literally buy, beer from a
beer
24-hour
anywhere.
garage.
Yes.
But yes, buying beer from a place that is specifically set up to serve alcohol is impossible. Is it? Anyway, what is it?
Calabogie Brewing West Coast American IPA. It's called Bogey. So I don't think I've ever had this one before. I don't think when I used to live in Ontario I had this, but I
Where are they
can.
based, the brewery?
So they're from Calabogie, and which is like in the rough Ottawa area. It's out in the boonies a little bit, and
I'm gonna say
so
I don't think I've had this at all.
brewed in Calabogie and Kanata. Kanata is a suburb outside of Ottawa for our international
And you've
listeners.
got the bogey one.
Bogey, bogey.
You know what a
I mean,
bogey is in England? Does that mean the same thing here?
like it's something in golf, isn't it?
No, a bogey in England is the thing that comes out your nose.
Like a, what do you mean a thing that comes on
We
your,
call them bogies.
like a, like a booger?
Bogies, yeah, the bogies in Hull. The
All right.
bogey. Yeah,
Well,
so anyway,
this
so
thankfully doesn't have that color. Um,
well,
you'll have
I'm
to
on
watch me.
water.
I'll have to describe this to you because you're drinking water, unfortunately for you.
Well, because I'm still at work, and obviously I'm being sent. No, we got some confusion on when we were recording this portion of the show. So I'm in the office, sans alcohol.
Well, I'll have to make up for it for the two of us. So, what do we want to cover this week? We're going to have shortly on the show. We're going to have Cheryl Oates join us. Cheryl has a lot of experience on the NDP side of the coin, so we're going to have her walk us through what's going on with the NDP, what does it take for the NDP to turn things around, and what to look for. So, that's going to be a great conversation. Looking forward to sharing that one. But first, we got to get through our top stories of the week. Where do you want to start? You want to start in Canada, US, UK?
Well, we should, because we got an election, we should
Stick to Canada.
start on that.
Yeah.
I was out door knocking this weekend in the very beautiful Okanagan, which was very nice. I went to Lake Country. It was stunningly sunny and beautiful, and I was door knocking there. But yeah, plenty been going on. So where do you want to start? I quite like the Badges story. Can we please start on the shocking and outrageous behaviour in this election of dirty tricks? Almost on a Watergate type level.
Yes, because I think it does not get more Canadian than this. So there's, as far as I can't tell if this is an inside Ottawa baseball story that where like no real person is actually paying attention to this, or whether this is like truly a Canadian scandal. But do you want to explain to our viewers what happened, or shall I?
So the Canada Strong and Free, which is a kind of right-wing conservative conference. Some liberal activists, well, employees actually, some liberal staffers of the party, right, in the campaign. I think they're from the war room, turned up and distributed badges that said "Stop the Steal." The idea was to therefore present Conservatives as Trumpian and as already setting up to say that if they don't win the election, it's all a big, steal. And that was it. And they got found out because they started bragging about it, I think, when they were drunk
They went to the pub and started bragging about their shithousery and reporters overheard them. And so it was the better part of 2 days, reporters were trying to find out which conservative activists had printed these buttons, because it wasn't just "Stop the Steal." It was things like "Free Alberta," or "Make Canada Great Again," or "A vote for Carney is a vote for Wexit," or "There is no climate crisis," or finally Danielle Smith for CBC Leader 2020-26. Reporters were interested to find out which conservative activists were out there trying to propagate these stories. The reporters couldn't find the source of these things. It turns out, fast forward 2 days later, they overhear these liberal staffers bragging about having caused all this ruckus at the convention. And to me, it's such a Canadian political scandal in the sense of this is the kind of stuff reporters find interesting. Everyone's like saying this is inappropriate. The Prime Minister, Carney, had to come out and semi-apologize for it. He said all these people who were responsible for this have been reassigned, not fired, reassigned. It has me wondering, when I was reading this story on my flight today, I was like, do you think the average Canadian gives a flying F about this?
Yeah. I mean, every campaign in every country, right? People get very excited about allegations of dirty tricks by one campaign. And I always think, everybody makes noise about it because why wouldn't you make noise? That's what people just do in elections about if their opponents are caught doing something dirty. I suspect not a single elector has their minds changed by any of this.
Right.
By Buttongate. I mean, they're called buttons here. We call them badges, but anyway.
Right.
By Badgegate. Although if there's one serious element of it, if we all agree that this is completely unacceptable and it's dirty tricks, for Mark Carney not to just fire them and just to reassign them does to me seem like there is a question of leadership. If you're saying this is unacceptable and it's dirty politics, well, surely these people's feet shouldn't have touched the ground as they left the Liberal war room or HQ or wherever.
Yeah.
So if there was any serious issue in this, it's it's a question of his judgment, right?
Yes. Yeah, I agree. But I think ultimately a blowover, because the stakes for this campaign and the choice that Canadians are assessing right now, I think are so much more important and bigger than this, that this will be a little blip.
It's like every candidate who has and it normally happens to Conservatives, despite the fact we're the bad people, it's always our boards that get absolutely trashed in elections. And we all post them on social media, pointing out what's happened to all of the ones I put my face on in 2015. People did such awful things to Joseph. There was one poster in particular. It was agreed that they wouldn't tell me what was done to it. And
your staff wouldn't tell you what was done to it?
No, it was the whole campaign was like, we can't tell him what was on this one poster. It was the only ones I ever put my face on. I know what was on plenty of the others. It was fairly, I like things coming out my forehead and all sorts, right? But this particular one, I was not allowed to know. And to this day, I don't. But anyway, what my point is,
I'm going to go find out what was actually drawn on these
this
things.
pettiness happens everywhere. I must tell you this one story. There's a colleague of mine who, sadly happens too typically, is someone came and put swastikas on his boards. He then took them down, put them in his garage, and did an interview with them in the background. So having identified this dirty tricks, he was then accused by activists, left-wing activists, of he was putting swastikas on his own boards and putting them out to try and garner sympathy. So these things happen in every election campaign, right? So,
well, someone was out on Twitter, I think a former city councillor actually was out on Twitter saying, well, actually, how do we know that the Conservatives didn't plant this to make it look like it was the Liberals who, oh my God.
I just think one thing there, if you are a left-wing activist, please stop putting swastikas on Tory signs. It is fucking offensive.
Yeah, it is.
But anyway, moving on. So offensive. That was the button or Badgegate.
Badgegate, which we spent more time on than we probably should.
Yeah,
I think There's a couple other interesting things that have developed over the last couple of days or last week that I think is interesting to our listeners. The first is a series of sort of media events that Pierre Poilievre and to some extent Mark Carney have participated in that are interesting. So there's a show in Quebec that's sort of a rite of passage. It's a show. It doesn't quite get the viewership it used to, but it's still a very popular show in Quebec where you show up. It's kind of like a pit style environment. You're being interviewed from different, like physically different angles where the guests are or the hosts are sat. Usually you have a glass of wine at the end of it. So it's a little bit like a variety show meets a talk show meets late night show, and it's for years it's been sort of this thing that you have to get through as an elected official or someone seeking elected office. And so on Sunday. And this is a live appearance, so it's really high stakes. Both Carney and Poilievre appeared, and it's gotten a lot of follow-up attention, both on social and on traditional media, because it's as big or as important of a moment as the debates are increasingly.
Yeah, because there's no show in English Canada that gets that proportion of the electorate watching it as this does in Quebec, right?
Yeah, it does. But
both of them did okay, right? I mean,
So I wanted your take on them. I watched both appearances, and I thought Pierre Poilievre did well. And the reason for that is because he clearly has a much more comfortable grasp of the French language than Mark Carney does. Mark Carney was very stilted. Carney looked like a school kid who was going for an exam. And he sat there and he just wanted to answer the questions and get through the next one.
And long answers as well.
Long answers, but there was a bit of fright in his face, and you could tell it was a bit of a chore he had to go through. And and it's not to say that he didn't have strong answers, and he was definitely well briefed. So I don't want to come off overly partisan in my assessment of him. But you compare that to Pierre Poilievre. I thought Pierre Poilievre was much more relaxed, and I think people saw. You certainly see this in the follow-up reporting. People felt they saw a different side of him. He was more charming, more relaxed. The feeling was, while he certainly did stick to his message, he did so in a way that was much more relaxed than how
less slogany.
Slogany than people have been used to. And so I thought, all in all, it was actually a strong appearance. And while the show may not get quite the viewers in real time that it used to, all the follow-up clips that it gets and the coverage it gets. The one tweet I saw from one of the hosts actually had more than like 300,000 engagements on it. So like it's getting a lot of traction. I don't know. Did you have a chance to watch it? What did you think?
I watched bits of it. Same thing. But I think that I don't think the audience came out entirely and kind of like embraced either of them particularly. But Pierre was more relaxed and better, right? But I don't think it was it wasn't like, there was a runaway where there was one who absolutely charmed the audience and one absolutely. But
I did have a colleague tell me that search results in Quebec for Pierre Poilievre started skyrocketing during the show. So I wonder if there's an element of, we kind of just dismiss this guy because he's a conservative. He's not one of us, this or that. And look at that, he's actually worth considering. So who knows?
Well, and the volatility in the polls in Quebec has been quite big. So it doesn't mean something. Presumably the second interview then was, are you talking about the Pierre Poilievre where he opened up about his daughter in English?
Yeah, so he went on to a podcast, I believe it's called The Knowledge Project is the name of the podcast. But within the first 12 hours, it already received 120,000 views. It's probably way past that. Of note is early in the podcast, he talks about his family and he talks about his kids and he talks about his daughter, who I believe he said is 6 years old.
6 years old, nonverbal.
Yeah. And he talks about what that means for him and more importantly, how he thinks about her future and stuff. And
fear when she's 60 and they're not around. And I watched it. I thought it was, he came across as incredibly human, and it was just a side of him you haven't seen from the kind of like, you contrast that with him eating the famous apple interview, which, looks a bit arrogant now and probably did at the time. And it was like a different person, really.
Yeah, and I don't know how the campaign can get more of this side of him out of there, other than I don't know, have him do more podcasts and more of these longer form things. But it's a side of him that was nice to see, because ultimately we also want our prime ministers to have personality about them, and to know that they're real, authentic, genuine people. So
I think it's really hard, though, having been in politics, as I don't know whether you know, but I used to be an MP. But it is quite hard, though, because politicians can't win, right? Because, you kind of like, people are like, oh, you shouldn't use your family and you shouldn't use this for political gain. But then if you don't open up, it's like, well, we don't really know who you are. We can't really see the human side. It's a really hard balancing act. I think that's why lots of politicians, kind of don't know where the balance is. And, what is just genuine and what you worry gets perceived as, oh, you're just now trying to use your family for political purposes. So I think that's why a lot of politicians choose not to talk about things, because, one, actually opening up and you want some privacy, but also, secondly, just you worry that you get attacked as being like you're using your family almost.
Well, and you're right. You could see a scenario in which
win.
You can't win. And if you see a scenario in which suddenly, if like the next 3 or 4 days, this is all he's talking about, it's gonna be like, oh, you're laying on. Do you think you've realized that you had a moment? So really, you can't overdo it. So it's.
But other than that, the polling seems fairly consistent. A couple of polls, which are one today, although it's Main Street, which has swung a bit wildly. I think was it Main Street had the Tories at 44.
Main Street had the Main Street polls have the last little releases have had higher numbers for the Conservatives as well, and it's all within the margin of error. But who knows? I mean, there could be. I think Ipsos had some numbers out as well over the last couple of days that showed a 4-point bump in favorability for Pierre Poilievre versus Carney. So who knows? We may start to see that things are turning around. The thing that everyone's talking about now,
continues to point to a Liberal majority at this stage, even those ones with the bounce. But maybe it's the start of a trend. Who knows? It's still a couple of weeks out. So
still 2 weeks. 2 weeks is a long time in this business,
Week is a long time in politics.
And the big thing this week is by the time the show goes out, we'll be either a day or hours away from the next round of debates. So we're going to have French debates on the Wednesday, English debates on the Thursday. And I actually quite honestly feel that this may be the first election in decades where the debates actually might have an impact, like could potentially move the needle. We'll hear from Cheryl shortly on how she thinks that could be an opportunity for Jagmeet Singh and the Progressives in Canada, in the NDP party. But given the ability for a couple key moments to get snipped and passed around on social media, and given what feels quite honestly like a high stakes campaign, am I crazy to have this view that maybe the debates will actually matter for the first time in ages?
So. I don't know on this, because I always, we always put big play on the debates in every one of the elections I fought back home. And in the end, I'm not sure they made any real difference. I always remember in 2010, the general election there, where, the Conservatives were fairly consistent leads over Labour. And then all of a sudden, Nick Clegg, who was the Lib Dem leader, I remember we were watching the debate in the Red Lion in Epworth in my constituency, which I was trying to win off the Labour MP at the time. And we were watching that debate, and then the immediate reaction of who won the debate came through on that immediate instant poll. Nick Clegg, the Lib Dem leader, just had this massive surge because he talked to the camera, whereas others, talked away, looked like he was directly addressing them. And then all of a sudden the polling went mad, and the Liberal Democrats were, up at, I think, 30-odd%. It was showing like it was, that it was a three-way race. And we had all that. And then the general election turned out with, I think, the Lib Dems actually coming out of it with slightly fewer seats than they'd gone into it. And it reverted to what it was. So I've seen the ability of a poll, of a debate to really mess things up. But I think in every election I fought where we all waited for this and we wait for this big moment, and parties always create a moment, right? They always create a moment. Yes. Our guy won because, and I'm not really sure when I think back. And ultimately, even that one where it clearly did make a difference in 2010, it's still a week or so after dissipated back to where it was going to be anyway, probably.
So if anything, it may have like a temporary bump, sort of bit of like a sugar high.
But,
and then it evens
there
out.
are other debates which clearly, isn't it? Was it Reagan in a couple of his when he was running for governor? And, people have these moments. It offers leaders the opportunity to have a moment, which may well then, if there's already a trend in one direction, abate that or play into it and ease that. I don't know, but I'm always suspicious of the ability of or the impact debates have. But anyway, we'll find out, won't we?
We'll find out. We'll find out. So
well,
that's
we've done
what's on
quite a lot on
deck.
Canada, so
That's what's on deck in Canada.
So UK, obviously we're mainly talking about Canada at the moment, but I just thought it was an interesting thing in the UK. Actually relates to my old constituency, that the Labour government, and there's two interesting things about this. So the Labour government brought back Parliament from recess, the Easter recess, and recalled Parliament, emergency recall for emergency legislation this past Saturday to take powers to basically save the British Steel, who are a company that's owned by a Chinese company called Xinjiang. I used to represent them, part of the steelworks and most of the steelworkers. And it's the UK's last blast furnaces producing virgin steel. And they brought, it's the first time Parliament's been recalled since the Afghan conflict. Generally, it only comes back in war, to give the government emergency powers to effectively direct the company to continue the blast furnaces running. They previously offered to pay for the raw materials, for the iron pellets and the coking coal to keep them going, and the Chinese owners had refused. First interesting element about this is when it got sold to a Chinese owner, everybody across the political spectrum was in favour because it was the only show in town to save the steel industry, which had previously been saved by Boris Johnson paying wages for a year of all the workers. So the interesting about this is UK government taking special powers to, and is there really any such thing as a private company in China? Statements that have been made is that the Chinese owners were deliberately trying to close down the UK's last virgin steelmaking capability by running this down. It had only hours left potentially to save the blast furnaces, because once you turn them off, it's very, very difficult and very expensive to restart them. So this kind of pushback against China, and conspiracy theorists, or maybe not conspiracy theorists, would say the intention all the time, all along, was to run this down, close down British steelmaking so that we were reliant on imported steel from China and elsewhere. That's the interesting geopolitics of it. Also, this is in quite a marginal political area where you have Conservative, Labour and Reform all kind of in the mix. We won the seat of Scunthorpe in 2019. We narrowly lost it to Labour in the last general election. Reform had a good third place. There's a mayoral election going on in the area. So Nigel Farage, leader of Reform, turns up a couple of days before, does the tour and demands it be nationalised. So you've got this right-wing leader demanding nationalisation.
A right-wing leader that's polling very well right now.
Yeah, polling very well.
Yeah.
And, to this, we've talked a lot about Reform versus Conservative. This is an example of that, Reform versus Labour. Now, would Labour have done what they would have done anyway? Possibly. And there was cross-party support for it. But this is Reform very, very much stamping all over Labour's traditional heartland territory in a way that Boris kind of did, of saying, we're gonna say. And I actually saw interviews with some of the steel workers and unionised steel workers who were saying, well, yeah, if Labour do, and these would be traditional Labour voters, saying, yeah, well, if Labour do the right thing, that's all good. But Nigel Farage is the one who's really got our back. So it's just another example of, there's that geopolitical element, but there's also this. This whole, where is British politics going at the moment? And we don't yet know where it's going to settle, with this whole Reform insurgency.
Fascinating. And the other, the big geopolitical angle there is just the degree to which I think everyone, as they are responding to Trump, is having to figure out where the realignment is on China.
Absolutely. And also the tariff issues were a part of it because, the UK, we used to export quite a bit to the US as well. So that all plays into it as well and if ever you need to have steel making capabilities, it would have left the UK as the only G7 nation without steel making capabilities. So,
wow.
Okay.
So quite literally a matter of national interest, hence the need to.
And so the powers are really quite strong. They direct, and they actually, the site management locked out the Chinese executives from Xinjiang from the site because they knew these powers were coming. And and it included in the legislation even anybody who was fired by the company, they had a right to be reinstated for refusing to. It's not a nationalisation yet, but I suspect that's where it's going to end. Anyway, all very interesting.
Well, let's move on to the U.S. then, just to close our outer issue scan. The story that caught my eye is one that's a little bit close to my heart, given my background in foreign affairs and sort of my military upbringing. But it's this note, this memo that's been leaked, in which apparently the Trump administration is proposing to cut State Department funding by nearly half, and in so doing would eliminate almost all funding for international organizations, including the United Nations, but more importantly, this one I care most about, is NATO.
All funding for NATO, the article says, which is incredible.
Which would be incredible. You know, I had talked about this ages ago, very early on when we launched the podcast. But I had, in a very inflammatory way, wrote this piece on my Substack, and I talked about how NATO is effectively dead. And I wrote that after Trump hosted Zelensky in the White House for that awful meeting, and I just felt like I just don't see a scenario in which, quite functionally, the U.S. would defend any and all of its NATO allies if push came to shove in a threat against Russia. And now with this news coming out that the money's going to dry up, I just don't see how NATO can quite function, can be functional in the way that we've long expected it to be when it's got no funding to work from. So I continue to hold this view that even if on paper it's not dead, NATO is going to be an organization that is going to be sort of this thing that we'll point to as this lovely agreement that existed between some shared allies for, I don't know, some 70-plus period, but that's about as long as it lasted.
Which is kind of where the UN has ended up now anyway. I mean, partly through its own failings in many ways, right? Because I remember when I was a kid growing up, when the UN resolutions and, UN secretaries general, people knew their names and, a UN resolution meant something. Now, I would blame the UN and many of the countries that are party to it for the complete failure, because it has become a complete joke. But, the NATO is made up of, let's leave Turkey out for now, of proper functioning democracies with the same values, which avoid all of that nonsense that the UN has of, people being in charge of human rights from countries that have no human rights, which does make a mockery of it. That's not the case with NATO. This is a serious organisation with proper functioning Western democracies at its heart. And it's also a funny one for Trump to be demanding countries do more to meet their 2% NATO target while saying, I'm going to cut all the funding, which I assume this funding is for the administration of NATO, as opposed to the military spend requirements. But again, it's just it's another example of America walking away from its allies potentially. Now it's a memo, right, and it has to get past Congress, any of this funding. So maybe this is not where it will end up. But the fact that these things are even being thought of in the administration are, to me, deeply alarming.
But this is also what I think the pattern of behavior we're seeing with this administration, which is throw something crazy out there, see how people react and freak out. Sometimes maybe you progress with it, maybe you change your mind after you've enacted it, but it's just like utter chaos and disruption for the sake of chaos and disruption and keep people on their toes.
I remember the article I quoted a commentator in, I think it was the Times, just after the Trump win, was saying that, chaos is Trumpism. This is, this is a deliberate political strategy. All of this, it's not, it's not just disorganized chaos. It's almost like organized chaos. This is, this is what it's meant to be. This is the essence of Trumpism. Yeah, of just throw stuff out, see where it lands, and then, a week later you're like, no, we don't think that. Never said that.
As we saw with the tariffs last week.
Well, yeah, yes, quite. Anyway.
All right. Well, on that news, why don't we cut to our interview with Cheryl Oates? We'll do a deep dive on what's going on with the new Democratic Party in Canada, why they're struggling in the polls, what it would take for them to turn it around, and after that, we'll cut to our tasting notes for this Calibogie Bogey. Hey. All right, we are so happy this week to have Cheryl Oates join us. Cheryl is a co-host of the Discourse podcast, which I highly recommend for a very fresh Western perspective on politics, and very interesting dynamics between two people on opposing ends of the political spectrum. Cheryl is also a teacher, teaches at the Max Bell School of Public Policy at McGill, and this was news to me. I didn't know this, but Cheryl used to be a journalist, and but where I know Cheryl from, at least in the media, is the role she played heading up communications for Alberta Premier Rachel Notley. So I understand in that role, Cheryl, you handle a lot on crisis management, wildfires, climate strategies, and so we're so delighted to have you on the show because Andrew and I, for totally different motivations and reasons, are very concerned by the collapse of what appears to be NDP support across Canada. Because obviously when the NDP doesn't do well, then frankly, neither do Conservatives. But welcome onto the show.
It's purely benevolence. It's purely benevolence. We just want the NDP to do well. It's benevolence.
Yeah, we'll see.
So I pulled up the latest polling numbers on 338. It doesn't matter where you look, CBC Tracker, the stuff that Eric Grenier has at the RIP. But I mean, it's as far as I can tell, it's looking not particularly great, 6 to 12%, depending on which poll's coming out. When I looked at it on my flight here to Ottawa earlier, it looked like Eric was projecting 8 seats for the NDP. That's compared to, to our listeners, and we have listeners from the UK and the US. That compares to 25 seats that the party won in 2021. Cheryl, what's going on? Can you explain this to us?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of things. One is that it's not necessarily that the party is losing like diehard New Democrats from their, they've given up their allegiance to the party and they've moved on to something else. It's in this particular case, their desire for Pierre Poilievre not to be prime minister is overshadowing their allegiance to the NDP. And so you see people moving to the Liberal Party just to hold like that anybody but conservative sort of mentality. And then the other thing is, and maybe this can sort of shape part of our conversation, is I do personally think that the NDP will outperform what it's predicting in the polls. Not just because I'm an eternal optimist, but because like history has told us that this is what the NDP does. And you've seen that most recently in the Ontario election. And we know that from the beginning of this campaign, the NDP has been really targeted trying to hold their incumbents. And so that means if you're spending a $30 million cap, the NDP is dumping that money straight into incumbent seats rather than having to spread it out across Canada. So one, we're seeing people move, at least for this election. And two, I do think the NDP will outperform in its incumbent ridings.
That's funny. I just came from from having dinner with someone in conservative circles, and I was saying, "Oh gosh, I actually think the polls are going to underrepresent the conservative vote, and that when the final comes through, we're going to see they actually outperform what the polls said." Pleased to see that you have the same perspective on the other side.
We all have the stories we tell ourselves, right?
Crossing our fingers.
Although the NDP at least have history on their side for that, because the NDP normally puts on a few points in a campaign and ends up outperforming, right? So at least there is some history there.
Well, and that's such an interesting angle. I hadn't thought of that, Cheryl, which is if you're taking the spending limits and you are being far more concentrated with where that spend goes, then presumably that should have some kind of effect in some key ridings, shouldn't it?
Yeah, I would expect it to in this case. And you'll never see that show up in the polls. Like when you're looking at a cross Canada poll, if you're saying, maybe you're looking at one seat in Atlantic Canada, a handful of seats in Southwest Ontario, et cetera, that's just not going to come through in the polling in a way that represents the number of seats that party's viable in.
Yeah. Why did it take, though, given that the Conservatives have been 20 points ahead in polling for over a year, NDP voters would have been seeing NDP supporters would have been seeing those same polls, and yet the NDP were continuing to bounce around 15 to 20%. And then it took Trump and the tariffs for NDP voters to say, oh, actually, we now want to stop Pierre Poilievre. Why did it happen then? And why hadn't that NDP collapse happened before that? Given that, it's for a year we've thought Pierre Poilievre is going to just sweep into power with a massive supermajority.
Well, part of it is the leadership change. I think a lot of voters that typically vote New Democrat that have now moved to the Liberal side had as much problem with Justin Trudeau as Conservative voters did. And so they weren't willing to say, anybody but Poilievre, so I'm going to vote Trudeau. They were like, I don't like Trudeau either. I will stick with my party. The fact that Mark Carney has come in as what a lot of people are seeing as a really credible option to be prime minister, but also to stand up to Trump, has now given people a place to move their vote. So there has been, as we've known, like this huge piece of voters who have said like, I'm really frustrated with Justin Trudeau and there's no way that that I could vote for him again. But that same group weren't necessarily saying, I'm really enthusiastic about Poilievre. Of course, some of them were, but now we've seen a portion of those voters move back to say Mark Carney is actually, a safe, credible alternative for me. And that's not specific to New Democrat voters. That's sort of like a block of people in the middle that sort of spread across political parties.
Yeah, we did a bunch of our own research, and we found something similar, which was there was some enthusiasm for Pierre Poilievre, particularly among sort of anti-establishment type voter archetypes. But the big sort of takeaway when we did this research like almost a year ago was just the degree to which the Liberal vote or the Progressive vote had collapsed, in the sense of so long as Trudeau was in the window, then those voters were going to stay home. What I found interesting when we did that research, and I feel like it's playing out in this campaign, but please correct me if you disagree. I felt that there was no excitement around Jagmeet Singh as the leader of the NDP, and as a result for the NDP. If I ask the question in a negative way, I'm going to say, why isn't he getting any traction? But I'm prepared to ask that in a more generic way, which is how is Carney able to vacuum up all that attention?
Yeah, I mean, there has been for the last couple of years, and I can only speak for the West because I don't spend as much time in Eastern Canada as I do in Western Canada. In the West, there has
I'm in
been...
Ottawa today, and it's miserable. I wish I could go back to Vancouver right now.
I'd love to hear it. There has been frustration with the positioning of the federal party as it stands in contrast to provincial sections for a number of years now. And Jagmeet Singh wears that frustration because he's the leader of the party. So, for example, Trans Mountain is a good example. So when we were in government, when the NDP was in government in Alberta, obviously we were pushing for this pipeline to Tidewater. It was great for Alberta's industry. And the federal party took a really specific stance that was against the pipeline. And so people who were in Alberta felt overlooked. We felt like, our industries weren't being taken seriously, and that, our party in Ottawa, who, the sections are actually constitutionally tied, wasn't listening to us and didn't understand us. And that has been the case in parts of sections across the prairies, and not as much in BC, but sometimes in BC. And so when you already feel a little bit frustrated, I think your vote is more open to moving, at least for one election cycle, than it would be had you been really happy with the performance of the party up to this point.
The thing I find really interesting is, obviously, we had a provincial election in BC. So this is, for British listeners, of which about a third of our listeners are, it's really hard for Brits to get their head around the fact that there are different provincial parties, different federal parties, and that some have the same name but are not connected. In the case of the NDP, they all have the same name and they are connected, so they run provincially and federally. But we had a provincial election in BC just a few months ago. The BC NDP win with 45% of the vote. Current polling has the federal party at 12%. For British listeners and people who don't, if I was a conservative in the UK and I was seeing those kind of numbers in a local election at a lower level of government, I would be horrified. If I was the BC NDP, is there any risk to the provincial parties from this collapse of the NDP vote in polling at a federal level?
It is sort of hard to explain because it doesn't make sense. Like it doesn't like, as I say this out loud, it will not make sense. But first, we're not nowhere in Canada is it really just a two-party race. I mean, it's close to a two-party race in Alberta, but there are still, other parties. There's 4 parties, at least, that are considered official federally. And then when you look at that compared to provincial sections, so let's take BC, for example, there isn't really a viable liberal alternative. So to say the NDP is going to lose because the liberal banner or the liberal reputation is growing, there isn't a viable liberal alternative at a provincial level in British Columbia to say that vote's now going to move there. And if we want to get even more confusing for your UK voters, the Liberals that used to be in BC were actually Conservatives that called themselves Liberals. So it just doesn't translate. Provincial vote does not translate to federal vote. And across Canada, we've seen for a long time, even when it comes to where you sit on the political spectrum, if you vote Conservative federally, you might vote more left, so NDP, Liberal, Green, provincially. And it's not necessarily the case that people tie their party allegiance to one side of the political spectrum across governance levels.
It's weird.
That was really not clear.
Yeah.
It does remind me. I found it odd because when I got started in politics, some 25 plus years ago, it was in Ontario, and it was possible to be in the Ontario PC party with federal conservatives and federal liberals in that party because they were like blue chip liberals who found a home provincially in Bill Davis's slash weirdly also Michael Harris's Conservative Party. So yeah, it's such a hard thing to explain to someone who's not in Canada, the differences between the provincial and federal parties. But truth is, when I find when I speak to like real voters, quite frankly, a lot of them actually don't know the difference. I mean, I remember when I first moved to BC 4 years ago, and I told people what my background was. I was trying to build my social network, and the number of people who would just start talking to me about how they couldn't wait to get rid of Trudeau in the next election, and they were during the entire provincial campaign were grounding the entire analysis of how they're going to vote for in the next election based off of how they felt about Trudeau. So it's just I'm not so convinced that a large proportion of Canadians necessarily make the distinction, but I could be wrong about that because clearly they do vote after vote.
Yeah,
the polls would suggest they do.
And another example of this would be I just ran the Alberta NDP campaign in Saskatchewan last year. And one of the biggest pieces of feedback we heard on the doors from candidates and volunteers was when they're knocking on the door for the provincial NDP, where the leader is Carla Beck, people said, well, I don't like Jagmeet Singh, or I have this problem with the federal NDP, or I like Jagmeet Singh, or whatever the case may be. But it was really hard to draw that distinction between how they felt about the federal party and how they felt about the provincial party. And you can see that in the poll numbers now. Like the NDP did phenomenal in both the cities in Saskatchewan, both Regina and Saskatoon. We swept everything except one seat. That will not be the case federally.
Right.
Yeah. If there is a near wipeout of the NDP, then that's not an existential threat to the provincial parties. It doesn't translate over the same way.
So let me just start with the question, because there will never be a wipeout of the federal NDP. The people in the NDP
Andrew,
are
you're
way
so biased.
Sorry.
They're way too stubborn. Like the people in this world, like I can speak for myself and I can speak for everyone that I've worked with in the NDP, like in sections across the country and in the federal party. People are in this not to win, but to continue to push for what they believe is the best for their province or their country. And it doesn't matter how the party finishes in this election. First of all, statistically, I don't think it'll be wiped out, but let's just hypothesize that the party's wiped out. It will not go away. People will come back with so much enthusiasm to rebuild it that this party, no matter what the election result is not going anywhere.
So to avoid, a wipeout, I shouldn't use the word wipeout, but if the polling looks like it's going to be very low numbers, what would your advice be then? What can the NDP do in these last couple of weeks of the campaign? Do they need? We keep hearing about pivots. I've never heard the word pivot used so much in the context of a general election, federal election, as this one, where everyone's pivoting all over. Pivoting or pirouetting, I don't know which one. But what would your advice be to the NDP now?
Yeah, I mean, I think they are doing it. It's they have to hold the seats that they have. That is the goal right now. I think it was really, really smart of them to not go at 30,000 feet and try to answer the question that Mark Carney and Pierre Poilievre are answering, which is who is best placed to lead Canada through this crisis, or who is best placed to take on Donald Trump. The logical answer to that at this moment is not the NDP, and so they're not asking that question. They're asking the right question to me, which is, do you believe you need New Democrats in Parliament to hold the next government to account for the things you care about, which for New Democrats are things like healthcare, is things like pharmacare, is things like dental care. We have those things because New Democrats have been in Parliament. They're asking the right question to say, if you really believe these things, do you believe we still need to be there? And I think that is the logical question for those voting in NDP incumbent ridings right now.
Yeah, I sat down with a friend of mine who's an NDP MP I've known for a while, and I said, it strikes me that, because, he said to me the same as you said at the top, which is a lot of people are, we want to stop Pierre Poilievre. And I was like, but actually you do that by voting NDP, but you can stop Pierre Poilievre. But it seemed to me, if I was an NDP strategist, I would be saying, you vote for, particularly where you've got incumbents, you vote for the incumbent, you're already stopping Pierre Poilievre. You're fighting taking on Trump if that's important to you. But at the same time, you're also holding the feet to the fire of Mark Carney and the Liberals on climate issues, on workers' rights, on healthcare, on, privatisation, a whole range of other things. And all of that can be achieved while still stopping Pierre Poilievre, because every NDP MP who gets re-elected is an NDP who's going to stop Pierre Poilievre. I mean, there's not going to be a Conservative NDP coalition. And I thought I'd have, as you say, there's been more of that messaging more recently, but I thought that would have been, as soon as this big poll boost for Carney had come in, I'd assumed that would have been the NDP's entire election campaign of, vote for us to keep the Liberals honest.
Yeah. And I mean, you have seen, I mean, it's hard to start a campaign not saying you're going to run for prime minister. Like that is, I mean, that's
admitting defeat
terrible.
before you start.
Yeah. That's terrible for morale at the very minimum. But I think that is sort of where the messaging has evolved to. And I think for New Democrats, which is mostly who this campaign is speaking to, is people who have voted New Democrat before, that is really, really motivating. Like for me, yes, I would love for Pierre Poilievre not to be prime minister too, but I also don't believe that the Liberals will, on their own, protect the things that I care about the most. And so it is really important to me that there's New Democrats in Parliament in whatever numbers to hold the government accountable. And we've seen them do that through the confidence and supply agreement. I know that the NDP is not going to form government, but I believe that they can fulfill that really important role again.
Do you think there's there's probably no magic formula to this unless you think there is, but I'm wondering if there's a sweet spot. Is there a number at which, if Carney's popularity or polling numbers hit a certain threshold, and Pierre Poilievre's are at a certain number where it's okay, progressive voters, particularly those who've traditionally voted NDP, feel okay, the threat, so to speak, of Pierre Poilievre is not nearly as intense as I thought it was. I'm prepared to go home now and park my vote where it normally is. Do you have a theory on what those numbers might look like?
I don't know exactly what the threshold for numbers would be, but this is always the push and pull of the strategic voting argument, right? Is of course, when you see, the Conservatives coming into the campaign projected to be a majority, people feel really motivated by that if their vote is first and foremost an anti-Poilievre vote. Now, there was a poll that came out today that showed the Conservatives rebounding a bit. That could be a big motivation. But certainly if Mark Carney sitting really high in the polls and people feel my vote, he doesn't need my vote to be prime minister, I think they're going to vote with their heart instead of their head. And it's not going to be a strategic voting argument. It's going to say, if I don't have to, I will stick with my party. So I don't know exactly what the number will be, but if Mark Carney stays in an obvious 200-seat majority territory, it's just not as motivating for New Democrats to move.
Yeah. And if you've got an incumbent NDP MP, the argument's even stronger. I mean, if you're in Vancouver Kingsway or Vancouver East, the Conservatives are not a threat there. So, it's it's.
Well, speaking of, are there any key ridings, Cheryl, that you think would be an interesting group of ridings for us to pay attention to on election night? Either because these are important incumbents, or there might be a surprise candidate, a surprise new face. Where should we keep our eye on election night?
So maybe I'll talk about Alberta just because I know it best and I have found it so interesting to watch because, as you both probably know, Alberta is like a conservative fortress when we look at history. Of course, there's been blips and, of course, Liberals and New Democrats have each won seats in the past. But for the most part, the federal Conservatives count on a pretty big sweep of Alberta federal ridings. Right now, if we believe the polls and you look at the seat projections, every single seat in Edmonton, the capital, is in play.
Yeah.
And that's not super surprising to me because the NDP provincially has held those seats and swept that city for the last 3 elections. But Calgary, too, there are at least 4 seats that are now in play. One is an incumbent riding, and then 3 additional seats that are, I think, listed on CBC right now as toss-ups. And that is real progress for the Liberals. If the Liberals come out on election night having won 4 seats in Calgary, I think they'll be really happy. And then I'm just going to throw it in for fun, although I think it's a stretch right now. I'm from Lethbridge originally, and the Lethbridge seat is, the Liberal candidate is the former mayor of the city. That seat goes Conservative forever. If it is really competitive by the time that people are casting their final ballots, that will be a really interesting one to watch.
And it has gone NDP provincially before, hasn't it, Lethbridge?
That's right. Yeah, both seats went provincially in 2015, and then the NDP has held one of the seats since. Yeah.
I think it'd be interesting also for some of our international listeners to get let's do a double click on Alberta, because Alberta, yes, on the federal side, is always voted Conservative in terms of just pure seat count. But it's also the province where you worked for government that was an NDP government provincially. So the NDP can perform exceptionally well, recognizing the distinctions we talked about between federal and provincial parties and some of the conflicts that sometimes exist between them. But what is it? Are there any lessons from what you and Rachel Notley, what you guys did with that campaign that the NDP could apply? Maybe it's too late for them to apply. Maybe it's something they got to look at in the next election campaign. But clearly there is a way to be incredibly politically successful in Alberta while sporting an orange flag.
Yeah, and the NDP will win Edmonton Strathcona, and the Edmonton's in play. The Edmonton centre seats in play for the NDP as well. It's not that the NDP will be shut out of Alberta. And in the next cycle of this, I imagine that any Liberal seat will also be a seat that the NDP has its eye on in Alberta as well. But in terms of lessons learned, I think people think of Alberta as a conservative place. But if you look at the last, election cycles of data, so much has changed. Calgary, for example, it was like 50-50 in terms of NDP vote and Conservative vote in the last election, although I will just throw in that the NDP did win the popular vote by just a little bit, because I think that's worth remembering. But that's a big swing in terms of historical outcomes in Calgary. And part of it is, just because people are thinking and changing their minds and because there's a viable alternative in the NDP that has shown progress. Part of it is because the demographics are so rapidly changing in Alberta cities. So the population of Calgary is young, it's entrepreneurial, the sectors and the economy is more diverse than it was, say, 20, 30 years ago. And it's far more multicultural than it was, say, 20, 30 years ago. And we have seen those educated, those young, those multicultural demographics leaning towards the NDP and the Liberals. And as those people get older and of voting age, and as those demographics continue to grow, that does give left-leaning parties an advantage, at least at this point.
Since we're doing Alberta then, a bit off topic, Preston Manning's piece about potentially Alberta separating the polling, which has shown 25 to 30% support. How seriously should we take that?
So I would love to just say, you shouldn't even pay attention to it because it's silly. But I do think that there's a group of people who truly, truly believe that this is the path forward, that it's something that we should seriously discuss should the Liberals form government. And I would love to just dismiss that and say there's no credibility behind it. But I'm worried, based on the rhetoric that's come from the Premier, that it will be taken seriously. So I think it's important to have the discussions right at the front, just to talk about how unhelpful this plan will be, that, if Alberta becomes its own country, it doesn't actually solve all of our problems, and in many cases will likely leave us economically worse off. I think it's worth having those discussions early on so that people aren't, separation curious and really thinking about going down this road and exploring it.
Well, it's good to hear. We talked about this briefly on our show last week, and Andrew and I had a similar perspective, which is this should be taken seriously. And yeah, Central Canada seems to want to frankly take a shit on Preston Manning for raising it and suggesting that he's doing it for political gain. But I'm like, no, I think he's actually he's giving one a bit of a heads up. Now, you can have whatever opinion you want on cessation tendencies, but it seems to be, I spent a couple days in Alberta last week knocking on doors myself. And I mean, it's a real sentiment. And it's something that people have to be aware of. So I think it's important for our listeners to hear that it's not just like those of us on the right side of the spectrum in Western Canada that are feeling that, at least cognizant of the fact that this is a live, active conversation that we have to be aware of.
I will say, reading Preston Manning's column, as a Westerner, I felt really frustrated that because he has a platform and because he has a voice, that he feels like, or people read it and think that he speaks for all of Alberta or all of Western Canada, when, granted, I do spend a lot of time talking to conservatives, but I'm not necessarily spending my time in conservative circles. Maybe my peer group is a little bit different, but no one in my world is talking about this, not in a serious way. And I know that, like I said, there are pockets of people talking about it, but I don't feel that his column was representative of the majority of Albertans and how they feel about it. I think the majority of Albertans see themselves as Canadians first.
Hear, hear. Is there anything about the campaign that you think everyone's sort of missing right now? I mean, from my perspective, it seems like we've been having an active conversation since the writs dropped on, this is a 2-horse race. It's between Carney and Poilievre, between the Liberals and the Conservatives. The frame is all about Trump and who's best to take him on. Potentially, there's a secondary frame around change versus stability. I feel like those are all themes that we've all hashed out at length. Is there a wrinkle? Is there an undercurrent that you feel has been not properly covered in this campaign. That'd be interesting for us to watch for the next 2 weeks.
Yeah, I feel like when this campaign is over, no matter the outcome, what led up to this campaign is what really is going to be dissected. Like if the Conservatives don't end up forming government, the lead up, like those 2 years where Pierre Poilievre was sitting so high in the polls, what could he have done differently? Of course, not knowing what would happen with the US administration, what could he have done differently to sort of like diversify what people were supporting him for? I think that will be talked about a lot. And if for some reason the Liberals don't form government, if they, the lead that we see in the polls isn't real or if that goes away, what happened between Carney's honeymoon and the vote will really be looked at very closely. Although obviously much of that is out of their control given the current economic dynamics. But I think it's a pretty straightforward election. A lot will be decided after the debate, of course, and then much will be talked about in terms of what went right and what went wrong.
Yeah. Do you think the debate's going to have any impact?
No. I think the debate's going to have a huge impact. Yeah. I mean, most people are saying that if you look at the polling, that they're sort of like decided they're going to stick with their party. But because the polls have been so volatile, we should assume that the polls are still pretty volatile. And I think people are looking at that to say, if Mark Carney has a terrible debate, if he's, lets the other candidates get under his skin the way that he did with journalists in that first week on the campaign trail, people are going to change their opinion of him. And same for Poilievre, who hasn't taken a lot of reporter questions to this campaign. There hasn't been a lot of risk. What happens if someone really gets under his skin or says something he doesn't like? Do people leave the debate saying, like, I like these candidates, I'm happy with my vote? Or do they decide, they're going to move based on that? I think there's a lot of room for that to happen.
Most people would probably agree Carney has the most to lose, given where he is. So, but of who has the most to win and who has the biggest pressure out of Pierre and Jagmeet?
Yeah, I think Jagmeet has a lot to gain. Like, this is his chance to really make his case. For those who haven't, because people watch at the beginning of the campaign, they sort of ignore it through this portion and then they tune back in for the debate. And if he really, really wants to make his case about why the NDP need to continue to be in parliament, this is his opportunity. This is like content creation, the best content creation the NDP will ever get, where he's standing up against his opponents and says, you need me to hold you accountable. There's a lot for him to be gained there, showing up their incumbent seats. And I think Pierre Poilievre, truthfully, I think people are looking for him to come with more than like a great rhyme, verb, the noun. People want to see substance from him that they haven't seen so far. And a debate is a real platform where he can do that.
I like that.
Well, I know who I'll be cheering on in that campaign, in that debate. I'm going to be, go Jagmeet, go.
Well, I won't be cheering anybody on because that might be foreign interference, right? So I have to be very careful about this. So we keep reading all this about this. No, I just think the whole thing's really interesting. I mean, just in terms of the campaign generally, it just seems quite a dull campaign, right?
I think this is like pretty normal.
I was going to say, feels a bit more exciting than the last couple of ones than me. But
I think
UK
it's more
general
exciting.
elections, normally a senior member of the cabinet punches somebody. There's normally eggs get thrown. I was like, come on, guys. Like, can we just have something a bit more? You
guys are just like, your political theater has always been a step above ours.
It's like some people handed out some badges. Everyone was very upset about it. But I was like, is that it? Is that it? Somebody turn them and put some badges somewhere? It's like, come on. We want more.
There might be like one great debate moment, but truthfully, even in this political era, the debate clips are kind of over too. So we'll see. Yeah. Maybe it will be surprising and there'll be some really, vote moving moments that come out of the debate. But I'm sorry, Andrew, this is like pretty much as exciting as it gets.
If someone doesn't pour a milkshake over a candidate for election, I'm going to pour one over myself just to feel like it's an election because,
I will come back on your podcast to watch
it.
Awesome. Well, Cheryl, it was lovely having you on. We appreciate you joining us and bearing with us as we mount our slightly partisan series of questions on you.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much.
Well, I thought that was a great interview with Cheryl. I learned a lot from that. She just brought a really interesting perspective. And yeah, I think Tories and Dippers have a shared interest here. We need both of our parties to perform well.
We're all Team NDP for this.
We're all Team NDP. Yeah, come on. All right. Well, Calibogie Brewing, Bogey, West Coast American IPA. I've been sipping at this for a little while. As you can see, slightly hazy color. Bit of a nice head that lasts for a while. It's good. which brought out some aromas. It is otherwise a very sort of classic approach to an American IPA, without quite necessarily the excessive hop treatment that you get from modern styles. And so it's got just a little bit of caramel malt in it. It's got just, I'd say, a subtle but present note of bitter grapefruit peel. That's sort of making itself known from start to finish. And it's got like the bitterness that you would expect from an old school American IPA.
I'm just letting you rant there. Well, not rant. I'm just letting you continue there because I imagine quite a lot of people, as you were doing all your fancy language and talking, whatever, were actually wanting to punch you, and I was up for that. Only metaphorically, obviously.
You mean they thought I'm a total fucking wanker? You could say
well, your words, not mine. Your words, not mine, Joseph. But yes, I know that's what I was thinking.
I was just trying to fill the air because you don't have a beer to drink from.
Well, no, but you filled it with look, great tasting notes, but certainly very, very posh.
Well,
fancy.
On that note, I'm going to hang up on you. We're going to call this episode a wrap, and I'll go finish drinking this.
I'm going to go get a beer.
Grapefruit tinged ale. All right, everyone. Thanks for listening in.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.